If you're a separating or divorcing parent, then I know that fears about your children will keep you up at night. These are top of your list of things to worry about among many things. And you want to know, will my children be permanently scarred? Will they be emotionally devastated by our decision? Will they struggle with moving back and forth between their homes? Will their academic and social lives take a hit? And most of all, will they have trouble forming an intimate relationship of their own in the future? Our guest today is Dr. Lisa Herrick. She stays up to date on the latest research on the impact of divorce on children, including what hurts and what helps. Hi, I'm Kate Sharp, host of Divorce on Planet Earth, Real World Advice for Well-Intentioned Humans. I will introduce Lisa. She is a clinical psychologist based in the greater Washington, D.C. area, where she works with families as a psychotherapist, also as a mediator and a collaborative divorce practitioner. She occasionally serves as an expert witness in custody disputes, and she focuses on educating the court on child custody issues. Lisa is also an internationally recognized trainer of divorce professionals, and she is the co-author of the books Navigating Emotional Currents in Collaborative Divorce and Mastering Crucial Moments in Separation and Divorce. Lisa is back. She first joined us in March of 2020 to talk about the research and what it had to teach us at that time about how parents can best protect their kids. That's episode 25. It's packed with really helpful information. So if you haven't listened to it, I really recommend that you go back and listen to it. And Lisa's here today to give us an update on the research. Welcome, Lisa. It's great to have you back.
Thank you.
When you first came on our show in 2020, you talked about some really, I think, important lessons from the contemporary research on divorce that gave us really new ideas about what works best for kids when their parents divorce. It's a pretty big sea change.
Yeah, the research really it's just been so helpful over, the last several decades. And ideas have really shifted over time. And as always, new ideas that come into our culture take a while, to take root. Sometimes they just don't make sense to people because they've been carrying old ideas for so long and they can be counterintuitive. But I really appreciate the research because it gives us actual data. It's not always conclusive, but at least it gives us some guide points for how to understand things as we understand more and more about children when they're in families that divorce.
I remember that you shared some really, I think, effectively reassuring information with parents about the idea that divorce is not default doom and gloom outcome that we once believed it to be when the early research came out in the 70s or so, and that there were factors, so protective factors and risk factors, and to the extent that parents could put these protective factors in place, they could really affect in good ways their kids' adjustment. Maybe you can just really briefly sort of give us a nutshell version of those factors. And I've encouraged people already to go back and listen to that episode, but I think it might help for today.
Sure. Yeah. I think the big takeaway that the research tells us is that, parents really do have some control. They have input on how their children are affected by any separation or divorce. And while divorce is, for most children, a sad event, a confusing event, it's sort of a destabilizing event, that is really different than the idea of long-term damage. And the research is pretty conclusive. We have a lot of data on what protects children and what places them at risk, sort of in general terms. The very top risk factor is conflict between parents that goes on. We don't mean that, parents who have really some intense struggles as they're separating, as they're divorcing, that's pretty inevitable. It's very hard to go through this without upset. It's the conflict that really doesn't go away. It persists over time. It, emerges in front of the children. It's more of a risk when those conflicts really are related to the children themselves, or the children feel like those conflicts come from them. That's really the biggest risk factor. So to the extent that parents can get help to compromise, to cooperate, to deal with their own feelings as they go forward, that's going to make an enormous difference for their children. The second one is, and this makes sense, when kids don't have a great relationship with either parent. That's tough no matter what. But when parents separate, if the children really struggle with either of their parents, that is a risk factor. So getting help for that, getting intervention for that, getting support for that, really important, can make a big change. Third one is when the child experiences not having enough time with either parent. So that's the child's report. If they feel like they're missing one of their parents, they're not seeing them enough, they want that parent to see them more, they want that parent to be more involved, that is a risk factor over time. And then finally, the children's experience of anxiety about financial strain. So that one is not about downsizing. It's not about not being able to go on fancy vacations. That one really is the children's experience that the parent or parents are very worried about money. That is a risk factor. Protective factors sort of include the opposites of all of those, but also having siblings is a protective factor. Having a good relationship with siblings is a protective factor. And just having parents who really tune in to the kids, talk to them about each phase of this change, talk to them about their feelings, recognize their feelings, all of that can really help kids get through this.
As clinicians and as human beings on the planet have certainly had the experience of how hard it can be when you're going through the emotional maelstrom of your own divorce to put your kids' needs front and center. But this is a really important wake-up call to parents, I think. It's reassuring too, but it's a wake-up call to, get it together in some ways for your kids. One topic that we didn't delve into last time you were here is a really common one. It's a question that I'm sure you hear a lot, which is, what's the best age that our child should be, or the least worst age our child should be when we get divorced? In other words, how meaningful is the idea of managing the timing?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And it doesn't have simple answers. I think the way to answer this question is to address what we know about children's development as it relates to these kinds of changes. So really little kids, infants, toddlers, preschoolers, this change in the family can be very confusing. It can be very unsettling. But these children are not going to have long-term memory of the family before the separation. And so these kids are not likely to carry the kind of, anger or resentment or sadness into their future because they were so little. And if the changes are handled well by their parents, if they're spoken to, if things are explained, little kids are very concrete. So when parents help them understand very concretely, this is where this parent's going to live, and this is where that parent's going to live, and where is it, and what does it look like? And yes, you're going to have a bedroom in both places, and you're going to have toys in both places. All sorts of things can really help little ones adapt. So I would say they are perhaps at less risk than the older kids. Elementary age kids, as we know, sometimes don't talk as easily as little kids or older kids about their feelings. They're very into peers, they're into what's happening in school. And they also have a lot of magical thinking in the elementary school years about what they can make happen and what they are responsible for. So it can be very stressful for, let's say, 7 to 11-year-olds, 7 to 12-year-olds to go through a divorce, in part because they often take responsibility for the divorce, and they have intense wishes and fantasies that somehow they can bring their parents back together. So addressing that is really important and will help those kids. It's also, as kids approach teenage, they tend to begin to feel their oats, their power, and they tend to feel like they can voice anger or they can act it out. And so when big changes happen that interrupt their lives, we often see these preteens really protesting in various ways. Sometimes one sibling will act out and protest while another will go along to get along. But in general, this age, it's tough on this age because they're not old enough to really deal with it in mature coping styles, but they feel it intensely. So helping them through it, very important. Then you get into adolescence, and as we all know, as parents, like teenage years are tough for many different reasons. Teenagers want control and they want power and they want to say. And so when life is turned upside down for adolescents, one of the things that really is going to make a difference is how are parents going to take in their kids' input while not putting decisions on their shoulders? Sort of how do you give limited control to a teenager without making them feel like they need to figure it out? And that's a tough one. So I would say teenagers are definitely at risk when they go through this, but again, parents can really help them through various ways. And if children are involved in activities and connected to peers, they have ways of reaching out in other parts of their lives that maybe 9 and 10 and 11-year-olds don't. Finally, I just want to say briefly that we have learned that even though kids have launched and they're in college, or they're launched from college and they're getting married and they're living their own lives and they're grown up, divorce can have a powerful impact on them. It shifts. It's not so much concrete disruption. It's the meaning of it for them, the meaning of what did they make of the permanency of relationship and commitment, and what does love mean, and what does trust mean? But also it raises all sorts of questions for them about what their family was, and can they really take with them all the good things from their family before the change and understand the divorce sort of in a context that's a little bit more complex.
I've been really interested in the thinking that you've been doing lately on of the impact on adult children of divorce, of this later life divorce of their own parents. And it's a lot. It's happening a lot as the gray divorce phenomenon grows. People are getting divorced a lot later now. It's a big topic. We can't really do it justice today, but it really has implications, when you're an adult and maybe these are people who have their own families, potentially have their own children. Having your parents divorce means that lots of things that you really looked forward to are now very difficult to navigate. What does it mean to come home with your kids when the grandparents don't live together anymore? How do you do holidays? Where do you stay? All of it.
Absolutely. Those are some of the things that have surfaced, just that you mentioned in the data, that adult children are often not ignored by older parents who are divorcing, but there are assumptions that they're really going to be fine. They're launched, they're grown up, they understand. One of the common problems that older parents who are divorcing make is they turn to adult or older children like friends. They confide in them. They speak openly about their problems with their ex or their bitterness about the marriage, and that is not helpful. Even if your children are in their 30s or 40s, they really need boundaries and they need to be protected in ways that sometimes we forget because they're grown up too. And as you say, when our adult children get married, when they have children, it is really important for parents, older parents who are divorcing, to have conversations with their adult children about how can we organize things? How can we organize holidays? How can we organize your visits with the grandkids? And absolutely not to put the kids in the middle of how come you're not staying here for 3 days? How come you're staying over there for 3 days? And I want to see the grandkids as much as, the other parent wants to see the grandkids. That's so stressful, no matter how old you are. So just try to be mindful, I think, of your adult children as children. They're going through this as your children.
Yeah, they're always your kids, regardless of how many companies they've started and sold.
Exactly right.
You're talking about the importance of speaking to your adult children about your divorce. It got me thinking about the topic in general, about talking to children about divorce. And I think you and I have often been surprised at how little that actually happens in an intentional way. And it's complicated. Sometimes people do talk to their kids, but they talk to their kids about what's been flagged, in their own minds as being important. So they might ask, when do I tell my 8-year-old that we are finally divorced? And the answer is they don't really even know what that means. And I hope you're not talking about the judge to your 8-year-old. So can you maybe say a little bit about this?
Sure. Yeah. There's not a lot of research about, specifically about talking with kids and the impact, but there are a few really interesting studies that have looked at exactly that. And what we've learned is, yes, as you mentioned, parents sometimes don't talk to their kids very much about this huge change. Sometimes I think that's because of the mistaken idea that if you talk about pain, it causes pain. If you talk to your children about, that some parts of this, might be tough, that somehow that's going to implant in the kids the idea that it will be tough. Really, it's the opposite. Talking about hard things with kids, talking about scary things with kids is a relief. It gives children the capacity to try to understand, to ask questions, to learn about it, and to find ways of coping with it. So one study that I read that was just interesting looked at really little kids, preschoolers, to see what did they understand about divorce. And the nice thing about that study is they sort of did it before and after. First, they just talked to the children about what do you understand about what's happened in your family. Well, they really didn't understand very much at all. And many of them had very strange ideas. They were trying to make sense of it and they couldn't because nobody had really talked to them. They had heard the word attorney a lot in the house. They had heard the word judge a lot in the house. They had no understanding of what those folks did. Sometimes they thought they were very scary figures in life. They really didn't see them as helping professionals. They didn't understand that. So in that study, there was an intervention of the professionals talking with the parents about how to talk to their children and how to teach them, how to help them understand, how to address their fears. Then they checked in with the kids again. And as you would expect, the kids had so much more understanding, but so much less anxiety. They had language, they had a way of talking to their parents about what was happening. And that was really, really helpful. This is true no matter how old the kids are, but that was just one study that I read recently that I just thought was really important.
It's very important and often very difficult to figure out, how to broach this topic. I think the talk is something that parents really dread. And I just want to make a plug for consulting with a mental health professional with expertise in this area. It's really okay to do that. Someone like you, someone like me, we're all over the place to help you figure out what's appropriate for my kid at their age and stage and their particular personalities and kids of different ages and all that stuff. It's really helpful.
Absolutely.
Last time you were here, you did talk about the importance of kids having lots of time with both of their parents, having a schedule that involves substantial time with both parents. I'm wondering if you have any updates for us on that from the newest research.
Yeah, that research is ongoing because, of course, it's one of the core questions for parents and families is, the traditional older idea has been in our culture that one primary home is best, not good to bounce kids around like ping pong balls. And while it is true that it's really important to be thoughtful about the rhythm of time going back and forth to two homes, and it depends on the kids' ages, it depends on their personalities, it depends on what their lives are like, it depends on where the parents live. All of those things are important factors. And so sort of there's a big headline of it depends, but there has been a tremendous amount of research that really points to the benefits of what we call maximizing time for both parents. So is there a magic number? Well, yes and no. There are a number of studies that actually show that the closer to 50-50 parents have gotten in their custody arrangements, the better the children do over time in specific ways. And one of the really interesting outcomes is that the closer parents have gotten to 50-50, when they've divorced, when their children are quite young, like 3 to 5 year old, by the time those kids are in college, the young people whose custody arrangements approached 50-50 have much better relationships with both of their parents. So that's really interesting. It didn't hurt either parent to give up more time as long as both parents had the maximum amount of time possible. Those college students also reported better feelings globally about their families. Their experience of family was more positive. They had more positive thoughts about romantic relationships of their own. And here was something really interesting. The closer they got to 50-50, the less these kids were concerned about mattering to each parent. The idea of mattering, do I matter to my father if I only see him very part-time? Do I matter to my mother if she has moved to another location? It turns out that feeling like you matter is really important. It's important to development, it's important to health. We can talk about health a little bit later, but yeah. So is 50-50 exactly? Is that like the key? No, that's not the message. The message is maximizing time for each parent in a way that the family can sustain. So really trying to approach that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've heard about some research. You can tell me if I'm right about this, that, and we're still mostly talking about dads who have less time. I mean, I think it's changing, but I think it's still true. And that there is a kind of way in which these decisions feed themselves, that if a dad sees the kids, every other weekend and Wednesday night, which was the default when my parents were getting divorced in the 70s, then they sort of feel like they don't matter and they withdraw. And then it becomes this cycle in which the child feels they don't matter and the mother feels the dad doesn't care. And it creates its own kind of problem. And I think I heard, tell me if this is right, that in decision making as well, if a dad or either parent doesn't have an equal say in important decisions, they also tend to kind of go away. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. There is just great concern in the field of social science and divorce about father involvement, because the statistics are kind of horrifying about how many children have very limited contact with their fathers after a divorce, and how many fathers recede into the background after a divorce, especially if their time and their decision making is limited. This kind of makes sense, right? The pain of not being able to see your child or having no say so or being cut out of their lives, that's a pain that's very hard to cope with. And human beings sometimes cope with pain by moving away from it. And both parents really need to stay involved in a very, granular way, knowing who your kids' friends are, knowing which subject in school they're struggling with, knowing which teacher is their favorite, knowing if they're breaking up with their girlfriend or boyfriend. Just all of these pieces of their children's lives, the more they're involved, the more they're aware, the more they have a say-so, the more the children can talk to them and they're up to date. They know what their child is talking about. That is going to not only keep the parent involved, it's really going to protect that child as they grow up. And one of the interesting things, that comes up over and over again, and I tell you, it's frustrating. It comes up when I talk with judges and attorneys, is the idea that, well, shared parenting really only works if parents don't have conflict, right? No. When parents have conflict, it can be even more important for a parenting access schedule to be worked out that provides adequate time for both parents. Because A, it will keep both parents involved. B, it will give a child time to bond with both parents, and it will not make them feel like they've lost a parent or they've been rejected by a parent. And C, there's some evidence, this is still sort of in the theory range, and people are trying to figure it out in the data, but there's some evidence that even when there's high conflict, kids can do better with 50-50 custody, because in those situations, sometimes one parent is a bit more stable or a bit more healthy or a bit more tuned in than the other. And it gives the child time with that parent as well. Mm-hmm. So we're still trying to figure that out, but there is definitely data that even in high conflict cases, even when a judge imposes it, sharing time relatively equally is good for kids.
As you were talking, I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense in terms of the benefit of closer to equal time, the higher the conflict. And one thing that I think happens in equal timeshare situations, or what we call substantially equal, in other words, not exactly 50-50, but meaningful time of all the different kinds of time. So, the rushed weekday mornings, the homework, the bedtimes, and the more relaxed weekends, going to sports, like all of that, having that rather than half of whatever days are available. It means that typically kids have longer stretches without a transition. And the transitions are usually the points of greatest vulnerability between fighting parents. So there's that. And I think what you're saying is absolutely right. If there's a more dialed in emotional parents, then I know I've sometimes said to parents who know that kids are having a much rougher time, and they really are having a rougher time with one parent, that there's a kind of way in which if you have enough time in the warmer culture, you can kind of inoculate kids in a way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we need to learn more about that. Mm-hmm. And I really understand parents who sort of have the opposite concern. They feel like, I've been the go-to parent. I've been the parent that kind of takes care of my child's life. The other parent really hasn't. Mm-hmm. And how is my child going to fare in the other home when that parent does not really know what they're doing in the parenting realm? Well, that is a real concern. Like, I get that. On the other hand, most parents, they might have a learning curve, but most parents want to learn. After a divorce, even a parent who has been less involved or who doesn't know how to braid hair is going to be able to learn and wants to learn, and that's going to be good for the children. So again, as you mentioned before, getting help, getting guidance, getting support, finding ways to work as a team and get another parent up to snuff, like all of that is going to benefit children over the years.
Have you seen situations in which, when parents get out from under the watchful, critical eye of each other, that actually frees them up in some ways to parent more authentically or better?
Absolutely. I can't pull off the top of my head research about that, but as you and I know, after working for 30 years with these families, many of the stresses between parents ease up when parents have autonomous time in their own place, and they have a little chance to do it their way, and they do have a chance to get better at certain things that maybe they haven't done in the past, and they're more focused on their kids. I can speak from experience, Kate. I was divorced years ago, now like 25 years ago. It's kind of amazing. And my kids had a wonderful dad, but a dad who didn't see them very much. He had a job that took him all over the world and had him working late. They didn't see him that much. Well, when we separated, he had one-on-one time with the children. Like, he had time with the children. He had to be there, and he was there. And the kids and my former husband have said over the years, in some ways, that really, really cemented his relationship with them in a way that may never have happened if we hadn't gotten divorced. So weird silver lining that I would never have expected.
I've seen that too. And I mean, it's not without its challenges though, right? A lot of times spouses kind of work out a deal, and it's not necessarily along gender lines, but honestly, it kind of still is, in ways that are changing helpfully, but gender lines or just kind of roles, in same-sex couples of just, somebody does the parental heavy lifting even if they work, and somebody feels they have to, and maybe they do, or are free to work as hard as they want to. And that means that when they get divorced, there is this challenge of, okay, I'm losing the time I had around the margins. You know, I may not have been there to get them to the soccer practices or the dentist, but I was there at the games, and I was there at night, and I did a lot of bedtimes, and kids really do experience that as a relationship, like a real important relationship. If you I think you get a lot of points for wanting to be there even when you're not, right?
Yeah.
um and then, when people split up, then, just what you're saying, that your husband had to do, like, just figure it out, right? And that, but that figuring it out, and the parent who has been doing the most of the kind of hands-on stuff has to want to be a part of that conversation and support it. Like, how are we going to do this or work toward it? And again, like a plug, I think this really speaks to the importance of finding a divorce process where attorneys are going to want to work with you, probably bring in a mental health person or two to be creative. And that's not going to happen in a litigation model.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, if there's one takeaway from our conversation, I think it would be that, find professionals who are going to look out for your family and who are going to look out for your kids, as opposed to winning something for you. That's just an important paradigm shift, I think, for us.
Yeah, I'm not sure we say it enough, but it is the most important thing for us to say. To pivot a bit, one of the really interesting things that I've never heard about that you've talked to me about is that there is some research suggesting that divorce has an impact on kids' health, their physical health. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is really interesting. And while it's sort of alarming, it's also really helpful and gives us more incentive to work hard at our relationships, even when we're separating and divorcing. So, there's just been a lot of research over the last couple of decades in general about the interplay of stress in our lives with the strength of our immune systems. And I think a lot of people know now, kind of generally, when I'm under stress, that's when I'm going to get a cold. That's when my back is going to go out. That's when my migraines are going to ratchet up. Stress and unhappiness does play into our immune systems and how well we fight off disease and difficulty in our bodies. But interestingly, what they know now is it really goes into our systems, like cortisol levels are related to stress. And when cortisol levels are high, it can impact all sorts of things in our bodies in a long-term way. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at the impact of divorce on health sort of in a more external way. They look at different patterns in a family's divorce, and then they give parents and children at different ages basically surveys or interviews about things like, how well are you sleeping? How many hours of sleep are you getting a night? Um, how often do you have a headache? How often do you have a stomach ache? Do you think that you have any depression that's interfering with your concentration or lowering or raising your appetite level? How's your anxiety? How does that play into your body, your somatic complaints? And it turns out that when kids are particularly stressed by how their parents are handling a divorce, they have more symptoms of physical problems, poorer sleep, more headaches, more somatic complaints. There really is a relationship. It really is a correlation. So when you get back to this idea of conflict creates risk, when you get back to this idea of not enough access to one parent creates risk, what you get is sort of this baseline kind of conclusion, which I'm going to sum up this way, which I'm taking from a couple of studies, that ongoing threats to a child or an adult child or a young adult child's experience of emotional security create long-term distress. So threats to emotional security create distress. Distress, if it lasts too long, create poor health outcomes. And it changes people's physiological systems. So it's not just important, of course, we want our kids to feel like they matter. We also want them to grow up healthy. We want to launch them with healthy bodies. And so, yeah, this is really something to think about when you're going through a big transition like this. How to reduce the stress, how to provide support, how to help your child develop coping strategies at whatever age they are. Super, super important.
So I find that fascinating. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about how each of these kinds of health problems then feeds the others.
Yeah.
For example, sleep deprivation then becomes I think we know it's the great X factor in relationships all over the place because it impairs cognition, emotional regulation, all of that stuff, and makes kids very hard to live with sometimes.
Yeah.
So that can create conflict between parents and kids, and a lot of blaming of each other among parents. So it's all very important to be thinking about, and makes a lot of sense to me. But what would you say that a parent who says, okay, I get all of that, but there are stressors in our lives that we can't do anything about? For example, there is this tough situation that comes up more frequently than we would like, of not having situations about which the parents can't do anything. It might really be out of their control, but someone just doesn't even live near enough to spend substantial time with their kids, or is relocated and maybe is in the military and gets deployed, or is reassigned within their company. Those are struggles. Does the research speak to that?
Yeah, and I think you and I sort of are going to have this mantra today of when all else fails, or even when it doesn't, like, seek help, seek guidance, because there are things to mitigate stress for kids. So we do know that relocation, so a situation, for example, when a mother might have to move away, or might choose to move away. Maybe she's gotten repartnered. Maybe she's gotten a job. Maybe she can't afford to live nearby, and she decides she needs to lower the cost of living, and she needs to move some distance away from the co-parent. We definitely know that's a big deal for kids. The research suggests, as you might expect, that when it's a mom who relocates and has primary time with the children, it's going to create worse relationship for the mom and the kids with the other parent, who's often the dad. It's also going to impact in some negative ways the children's relationship with the mom who moves. It's really a tough thing for kids to manage. Mm-hmm. Physical health is impacted. And then, as you mentioned before, you often see that the distant parent becomes less and less involved over time, and even is less and less inclined to financially support the child. Mm-hmm. So, impact on college and paying for college. So this is a big deal. So I think the takeaways for what parents can do about this, I guess, are: number one, if there is any way to postpone your relocation until your kids are out of the house, do it. Try to stay living in close proximity while your kids are in the home. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. If you can't avoid it, then get really creative with a professional about how you're going to make sure the distant parent has enough time with your child, and how that parent is going to feel integrally involved in the child's life, even though they're distant. Depending on the age of the child, depending on how far they have to travel, what is the rhythm that's going to work best, so that the child and the distant parent really feel like they can look out ahead on the horizon of the next year, the next 2 years, the next 3 years, and see in the calendar, okay, we're going to see each other then, we're going to see each other then, we're going to see each other then. It's in the calendar. It's not left to chance that both the distant parent and the child can see, okay, this is when we're going to be together and how we're going to be together. And that the parent who has relocated supports that, facilitates it, makes it easy. That's going to make a huge difference to those kids.
I'm thinking back to what you said earlier about the crucial importance for kids to know that they matter to both parents, that they're in each parent's mind, in an ongoing way, that they're being tracked. And I know that can be challenging for parents who live far away, in part because it's just so painful to think about it. But I think that there are creative ways to stay up to date, on the things that are important to the child that are going on in their lives. So to know what to ask about when you have a Zoom call, to talk about, wishing you were there, asking for video, all of that it really does affect things, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And, I will say that technology and even, the comfort we've gained with Zoom during the pandemic has really helped some of these families where parents are living some distance from one another. I'm working with a family where there's a teenager in high school who is really struggling with math. And the mom who did relocate and that child moved with the mom is not great at math. She doesn't like math. She doesn't want to help her kid with math. She doesn't know how to help her kid with math. The child actually has a Zoom 3 times a week with his father to do math, to study math, to look at math. They are both looking at the material. They're sharing their screen. The dad is there. Sometimes the dad is actually doing his own work on Zoom while the child is doing his homework, but the child can look up at any time into the computer screen and say, okay, wait, dad, wait, what about this problem? Like, I don't get what this means. And dad is right there. It's on a screen, but the dad is right there to say, let's look at that. Let's figure that one out. Okay, let's talk it through. That hour, 3 times a week with that father is making that child feel like my father is there for me as I'm going through high school, even though he's living far away. So creative ideas, got to think of them.
That's great. And so much better and more like real life. I had this incredible situation in which a teenage girl that I work with in therapy, her mom actually moved to the other side of the country, and it's been very difficult to navigate that, but they're both musicians. So the mom plays piano and the daughter plays guitar. And that was something they always really shared, and they play together, they do duets and do arrangements. And this girl is also very technically savvy and has learned a lot about using these, whatever apps they use now to produce and mix and stuff. So they do this thing where they find a song or they write a song, and the daughter plays the guitar part on her own, and the mom plays the piano part, records it into this app, sends it to the kid, and the kid mixes it all together into these incredible music videos. And it's wonderful. And it's a real symbolically kind of integrating act. I think there's lots of stuff like this going on.
Yeah, I love that. That's a wonderful story.
Yeah, it's great. Well, Lisa, I really want to thank you for coming back and sharing all of your knowledge and your experience and your very, I think, reassuring suggestions for parents who are dealing with a very worrisome situation.
It is. It really is. And, one of the reasons I really love my work and I love working with these families is because when you're working with parents who are just thirsty for knowledge, how do I help our kids? Like, we are going through this. We've decided it has to happen for whatever reason. How do we help our kids? There's so much to do with them. There's so many ways to help them, and they run with the ball, and it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just very gratifying to know that there are ways parents can do this to really, really help their kids through it. It makes a difference.
That's great. Well, thanks again. I hope you'll come back when you have something new to tell us.
Sure. This has been wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks for listening to Divorce on Planet Earth, real world advice for well-intentioned humans. If you'd like to know right away when I have a new episode, you can subscribe to Divorce on Planet Earth on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. On Twitter, I am at Kate Scharf. On Instagram, I'm Kate_Scharf. And there's more on my website, katescharf.com, including this podcast's sister blog, Relationships on Planet Earth. I hope that what you hear on this show will be helpful. But since everyone's situation is unique, the content is not intended as a substitute for my clinical advice or recommendations. I'm Kate Scharf. Talk to you next time.